Hello everybody. Today I'm going to talk about names, and this started off for me when I was in I think high school, and they were telling me that there was a time before they had surnames, and I didn't realise there was such a time, but apparently what had happened was that about maybe 600 or 700 years ago they decided to start using surnames. So before that it was a little bit confusing. So you might have 5 different people you know called John. You say John of Aragorn, John son of Stephen, John the Knight, and all different ones like that. John the Younger, John the Older, John Senior, and you'd have to add that little bit at the end so that you could differentiate them, because otherwise you'd be saying, John, oh, which John? Is it John the one that works at the pig field? So, of course, a lot of people I know, you don't know their surname either. When you just meet them, maybe you work with them, usually you just know their first name. It's only when you get to know them really well, at a certain stage, or for certain reasons, that you find out their surname. And it's almost a stage in your friendship, or you get to know somebody when you learn their surname. So there certainly was a time when most people didn't have surnames. Now, of course, I say most people because kings and queens have had surnames for much longer, because they would come from a certain house, and by house I mean they would have a castle or area named after them. So, for example, the current Queen of England is from the House of Tudor. So her name is not just Queen Elizabeth, it's Queen Elizabeth Tudor. So her surname is Tudor, but in the days before they had surnames, she would be Elizabeth of Tudor, and her family are all Tudor. They're from that particular royal house. And the reason I have that is because what would happen is that there would be certain points where perhaps a king or queen would stop being a king or queen, and then they'd look at their distant relatives for who would take over, like if they died without an heir. And then there might be a succession war, and so you'd have a house, a different house perhaps, that would take over. And in other parts of the world, such as China, these other houses were essentially lords, or the next level below the royals, and they might become the kings or queens. So they'd get the support of other lords, and then they'd take over. So you might say that's not quite a democracy, but it was perhaps some way towards it, because you'd have to have the support of the different lords and ladies in order to become king or queen. You didn't necessarily have to have the support of the regular people, but you had to have the support of the lords and ladies, otherwise they'd come in and kill you. And so we had that sort of situation. So, of course, when they had surnames come around, they weren't always, not everybody was from a royal house or even a lord or higher title. Some people were just ordinary people, and they didn't know what their surname should be. So some of them just became, it's John Stevenson becomes John Stevenson, and that becomes a name. Or John Williams is John, that's John that knows William, or John Williamson, but you don't put the son on the end, you just put an S, because maybe it's the daughter, maybe it's Mary Williams. And so some of them were quite simple like that. Of course, we ended up with Smith. Now, some people thought that was Smith because they were blacksmiths. That was a common myth, but in fact Smith actually came from a lot of people that worked in the military, so they were soldiers, and they smithed their own swords and own weapons. So there can't have been that many blacksmiths. There wasn't that many, but there were a lot of soldiers, and so Smith sort of came from that. And Jones, of course, was just meant that you rode a horse, or something like that. But then some of them, they changed their name every so often, and it used to be really easy. Some people would go by 5 or 6 different names depending on the stage of their life. Might be called John to start with. They'd say, no, that's no good, so I'll call myself Henry for a while, see how that goes. And so the other thing is, before we go back to that, you actually had names that I mean, we established these names for a while, but at one stage we were just calling people after things. So you might say, oh, I'll call you Grass because you look a bit like grass. And that became Timothy. Timothy meaning grass. I'll call you Princess because you're a princess, but that's Sarah. I'll call you, you know, different things. And actually we still have that today in some cases. People, I mean, for example, they get called Apple. It's not a very common name at the moment, but it's catching on. That's just a thing. And you can call someone Flower. You can call them Angel. And of course you can call them Rainbow, River, all that sort of thing. And people think they're strange because that's actually in our language. But I've noticed this with a lot of African names of Africans who speak English. And they use regular English words in some cases. So you'll see people called Precious or Hope or, you know, things like that. And you go, all right, well that seems a bit strange, but then for them, it's a foreign language that they're using. So it sounds beautiful. So you do get that sometimes. But one thing that I was going to talk about here is that there are actually some names that haven't got an origin story. I mean, we know roughly what they mean, although you'll Google and you'll get 15 different versions of this, but the real one's sort of hidden amongst them. And then they might say, oh, it's from this area. But then you go, well, hang on, but it's also from this area. And when we trace them back, these names have existed since we started writing down what people's names were. And we call these ones forever names. And I find them quite interesting. So a lot of people, particularly Christians, because of course Christianity wasn't the first religion, and nor was Judaism. So if you're talking about names in the Bible, they were names that we used 2,000 years ago. Some of them are still in use today, but others aren't. And so if they were in use then, not now, they're clearly not forever names. Forever names have been in use the whole way through. And if you go back to the First Testament, I mean that's Judaism, that's 6,000 years ago. So yeah, sure, we can say Adam has been around for 6,000 years, but Adam wasn't I know the first person, but not actually. And certainly wasn't the first person's name. So Damu is just another name for Neanderthal. And of course we didn't always have Neanderthals. So, you know, you've got a time before that. And why would you call somebody after a Neanderthal? I mean, you know. So you've got these different names, and so some of them, so I'll give us a few examples just before I finish this. So Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are 4. You may know them as disciples. And yeah, that's true. So those 4 are disciples that are still in common use. Not because they're disciples, but because they've been in use the whole time. So they're forever names that existed before the time of Jesus Christ and after as well. They've been in consistent use for thousands of years. You also have names like Michael, not because he was an archangel, it's just a very common name, just always been in use. And then on the girls' side you have names like Sarah, Elizabeth, Melissa and Rebecca. Now, and then Maria as well, and Hannah. Now there's probably some others, and I believe there's around 100 all up, but they're names that I know you're going to say, oh well, they're from Hebrew, they're from Greece, they're from whatever, but then you look back and you go, well actually it's not. And you look at a name like George, for example, and there's over 100 different versions of it throughout the world. One of them being Hodor. Now you may remember from Game of Thrones, Hodor was supposedly hold the door. No, it's actually just a Hungarian version of George. You may think, oh, Jorge, Horgan, they're not George. They are actually. They're just versions of George. So then some of them are pronounced differently as well. You get like Sarah, for example. That one's not changed very much in other languages and other cultures and other parts of the world. It's in China. It's in the Middle East. It's in Africa. It's Sarah and Saha and Zara and Shari and Shangri. They're not much different, and that means princess, of course. And so we have, if these forever names that have always existed, end up in all parts of the world. So even if you're in somewhere where you're like, oh, we don't have such common names, well, you actually do. They just might be spelled a bit different, pronounced a bit different. You know, you're in Spain and you're going, oh, we don't have George, we have Jorge. Well, Jorge is George. It's just a Spanish version of George. What? So, you know, they're the kind of interesting things that they have just always existed. So you might think, oh, well, why haven't we always had a flower? We don't use flower as a name today. We just don't. So I guess they're just popular names. And why they were forever names, I don't know. Did we get together at the beginning of when humanity first arose, and we just went around and said, well, what are some good names for people? And we picked 100 different names for the first 100 people that gathered together, and we just said, well, they're good names. So then we kept using them. Maybe that's what happened. I'm not really sure. I wasn't around then. I haven't really investigated to that level. But certainly it's an interesting thought that we have had these names, that what we call each other, that have these patterns and this consistency. And I mean, my name, for my three names, means Water Forest Lord. None of them are forever names. They're all regional, and they're all, well, 9,000 years old, 6,000 years old, 7,000 years old. So a little bit old, but not exactly forever. They're all regional. They don't have versions of them in other parts of the world. So you can call me Lord of the Forest Water. I think I might make some bottled water using that name. Or I could try to get people to call me Aquaman. That'd be nice. But there's a little forest thing in the middle of my name, and I'm from 3 different countries. My name, 3 different regions. Is it Illyria, Scotland and Wales? Illyria sounds a bit exciting, but that's just Albania. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to go over today. Just a little bit of names. If you have a name and you're not sure if it might be a forever name, just let me know. Perhaps leave a comment. And if you like this video, please like, and I'll try to have some more interesting videos in the future. Anyway, see you there. Bye bye.